So a quick introduction. Hi, I'm Ashley Mears. I'm one of the co-founders and co-organizers of the Ethnographic Cafe, along with Loic Fauquant, hello, and Ekedi Mapondo Dika, who is here, hi, and our terrific webmaster, Dylan Aren. And yes, actually lots of grad student support that we work with. So we started this Ethnographic Cafe in the spirit of reading ethnographic texts. We read about one per month, and we bring in the author for a discussion. We have really kind of great breadth of ethnographies, new ones. And then we thought, why stop there? Why not also do some special events? So we put on, this one is our first special event on doing digital ethnography. And I'll just put in the chat that we do have a couple of other events coming up this semester. Our next one is with Claudio Benzicri, whose new book is called The Perfect Fit, on April 29th. And next, our final event, our special event, will be on May 20th. That's Ethnographies in and of the Global South, Critical Reflections. So you can find all of this on our website, along with kind of really interesting curation of notes, picture essays from people's field sites. We also have a book nook of recommendations of ethnographies that we're all reading. You're welcome to contribute anything if you'd like to as well. So before I pass it on to Melissa Aronchik, who will be moderating, let me do some brief introductions, starting with Melissa and then moving on to our panelists. So Professor Aronchik is an associate professor of media studies in the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers University. Her latest book is called A Strategic Nature, Public Relations and the Politics of Environmentalism, that's co-authored with Maria Espinoza. It's a critical look at the intertwined history of environmental inaction in the US and the rise of the PR industry. On to our panelists, just going in the order on which the heads appeared on the poster. We'll start with André Brock, who's an associate professor of Black Digital Studies in the Department of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Institute of Technology. He was trained in library and information sciences. He's a scholar of race and social media, and his award-winning book is called Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures. Next is Sophie Bishop, who is a lecturer in cultural and creative industries at the Management School of Sheffield University. Sophie researches promotional culture and creative work on platforms. Her work has appeared in Social Media and Society, New Media and Society, Feminist Media Studies, a whole host of popular press publications. And she's also currently the specialist advisor on the UK's parliamentary inquiry into influencer culture. Super cool. Jeff Lane is an associate professor of communication at Rutgers University. Where's Jeff? Oh yeah, there you are, hi. Jeff studies how living in poor neighborhoods is being transformed through social media, and his award-winning book is called The Digital Street. And our last panelist is Nick Seaver, who's an assistant professor of anthropology at Tufts, where he also teaches in the program on science, technology, and society. He's an ethnographer of algorithms, music recommendation algorithms in particular. That work has appeared in cultural anthropology, cultural studies, and his forthcoming book is called Computing Taste, Algorithms and the Makers of Music Recommendations. So four very different scholars from different disciplines, different subjects, and we've collected their favorite readings on digital ethnography. And what we wanted to do was just invite them to come share some tricks of the trade of what it means to do digital ethnography, which is something that so many people are now thinking about in new ways. So with that, it's a pleasure to welcome you all. And now I'll turn it over to Melissa Aronchik for moderation. Great.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and thanks everyone for being here. Such a pleasure to have so many people with us today. So I'm Melissa Aronchik. I co-chair, along with Jeff Lane, the Rutgers Digital Ethnography Working Group, which is one of the sponsors for today's event. Our group is dedicated to supporting ethnographic research in the digital age and to building fellowship. We provide workshops, training, writing groups, just really making sure we have the resources we need to do ethnographic fieldwork in offline and online worlds. Our group has faculty, postdocs, and students at the School of Communication and Information at Rutgers, where we're based, but also at other Rutgers units and indeed at other universities in the US and internationally. Lots of members on the call now. I'm going to drop a chat into the chat, a link to our website where you can sign up for our mailing list. We'd love to have you join us and get apprised of upcoming events. We will also put our Rutgers, our Twitter handle, Rutgers Dug, into the chat in a moment. And then finally, I'm going to put into the chat a link to the Ethnographic Cafe's special events, where the readings that each of today's panelists have suggested, their favorite readings, are there. If you haven't already had a chance to take a look at them, I'll put that link in there so you can have a look. Now let's quickly move on to the panel itself. Our panelists today will talk about how ethnography gets done, the data, the relations, the dilemmas, and opportunities of the fieldwork. Each panelist will take about 10 minutes or so to discuss how they do digital observations. After each panelist gets a word, we'll open it up to discussion. And so I will be moderating that discussion. If you have questions as the panelists are speaking, we ask that you put them into the chat. Holly Avella, our fantastic coordinator who's here, and I will monitor and keep track of the order in which they appear so we can ask them either on your behalf or call on you to ask them. And then we'll get some sort of show of hands thing going after for the Q&A as well. So great, let's get started. Maybe I'll go in the same order that Ashley introduced people. So we could start, if you don't mind, André, with André Brock. And I'll pass it along to you.
I knew you was going to say that. Good morning. I'm having video issues, so pardon me 1 second. All right. Come on. Do what I say. Okay. I have to share my browser access. So let me just talk about what I was going to say instead of showing a slide, trying to be all professional. So I really appreciate being invited to this panel, in part because I know that I kind of came up with a hybrid critical discourse analysis that I refuse to call a method. And so I appreciate being hailed by this panel as someone who does something that could be understood as ethnography. And so I want to talk a little bit about CTDA, in part because it helps me explain what it means when I'm saying I need to capture data, and then how that data can be then set up to be analyzed and draw conclusions from. So CTDA is a method that I came up with that asks researchers to interrogate the technology that the people they're interested in are using, and the people, and incorporate an epistemological standpoint of the people who are using it. And it does that in one way by employing a conceptual framework that combines elements of critical cultural theory, science and technology studies, and whatever your interest is in, right? So if you're interested in doing queer theory, you can add the perspective of queer folk to that. Or if you're interested in doing differently able people, that's another perspective. And the key is that the conceptual framework serves as a lens for the perspective of the underserved or the minoritized population that you're using, in order to decenter the objectivist, positivist frameworks that we rail against as ethnographers and qualitative scholars, right? So CTDA analyzes disparate texts as discourses using that common conceptual framework. And I ask when it's done, because I'm not the only person who's doing it at this point, it's a critical discourse analysis of the meaning-making capacity of the interface and the practices that are embedded in that interface, and the comments, the discussions that the users have about themselves as they use this product, right, or project. So the key thing is when collecting data, it's multimodal. I'll give an example. The easy example is Black Twitter, right? So I've been studying Black Twitter for a minute. in the analyses that I've done, I go to great pains to make sure I am specific as to which version of the Twitter interface I'm using, because each one mediates you as a user differently. So those of you who are power users for Twitter know that TweetDeck offers you a very different perspective than the Twitter client does handheld, right? And so even though I don't know what my users that I intend on talking about are using, it's contingent upon me to be able to discuss an interface and say that this interface does certain things. So that requires screenshots, screencasting, but also some light, I would argue, I don't know what the right word to call it is, I guess, because you yourself are trying to engage in the practices that you want to talk about. So let's say I'm talking about Twitter and I'm discussing the function of quote tweets, right? I need to understand what a quote tweet is, right? It's not necessarily something that is prominent across every platform. Some call them reposts, some call them repair, some call them, what's the one on TikTok, stitching, right? And so you have to be specific as to that. And in doing so, I feel that that offers you a way to understand how the technology is mediating and creating the persons that it's trying to use. So that's one set of data that you have to collect. And again, screenshots, actual user interface. If you are really smart, like some of my co-panelists, you can download the code to see it, or the API to see what types of data it's collecting, right? So that's one side. And then the other side for me, Twitter makes this easy, where I collect the discourses of the community itself, right? And I'm been teaching CTDA workshops recently, so I'm freshly primed to say this. For many cases, when you're talking about internet discourses, it is tempting to just capture the utterances that your participants are saying and leave all the other stuff out. You will probably gloss their username or their display name and the way of preserving their privacy, right? As a good qualitative researcher should be mindful of, right? But for the way that I urge people to do this work, and going to Goffman, if you're just taking the utterance, the sign, but not the signs given off, you're not doing that user any favors, right? You're glossing your analysis and reducing it to the complexity that your discipline can handle without acknowledging the complexity that that user brings to their own experience. So my data collection for Twitter as a discourse community are the tweets, but I also screenshot those as well. Right, I capture the tweets in JSON format, or I now have access to the Twitter API, the academic stream, so I can capture more raw data about that. But I capture screenshots as well because I don't know how many of you are Twitter users, that you can change your display name at any time while your username remains the same. So recently, for the last 6 or 7 years, I've been Thought Leader, THOTLEEDURR, but my username is Doc Dre. And depending on the event or the phenomenon, whether I feel particularly motivated, that thought leader may change, right? So if I'm talking about the utterance of a person in the community and they change their display name to reflect either an affiliation or even a mocking of another event is going on, I need to capture that that piece of information as well, right? I'm making it sound more complicated than it is. In many ways, it's easier to capture Twitter data now than it ever has been. I'm beta testing a tool called DocNow, which has access to the Twitter firehose and will capture all this data for you and reconstitute it in the Twitter format that you need to analyze. But I've previously had to use software like NVivo, Hyper Research, Deduce, which requires you to clean the data. It can't handle it raw to put it in, right? And as a qualitative researcher, I make sure that I write about the limitations of the software and analyzing the text that I have. So I don't know if that's 10 minutes, but I can stop there.
Thanks, André. Great. I'm sure I think what you're basically doing is setting the stage for about 50 questions to come on in. So that's great. We'll have time for that. Okay, let's move to the second person on our list. We have Sophie Bishop who's going to present now. And I think, Sophie, you have some slides to share. So I'll let you go ahead and share your screen there.
Cool. Can people see them? No.
Yes, looks good.
Hey, from current slide. Cool. Thank you so much for having me. This is great. It's so great to be part of this event. I guess like what I was thinking about talking about is finding a way in to study what I look at, which is influencer culture. And influencer culture, like especially even now on TikTok, is becoming much more individualized. it's very fast moving. There are kind of events around it, but obviously the pandemic shaped that. And, not everyone is at those events. So it's like, how do you find some purchase to get in there and find out what you want to do your ethnography on? So what a perspective I really like is from Taina Buha, which she talks about in her 2018 book, If Then, I think it's called, which she thinks about kind of like algorithmic media as a red herring. So the idea that algorithms are black boxes that we can never know about is a bit of a distraction, like a piece of information that distracts from all the other places that you can find out information about how this culture works. So she gives a few examples in this quote. I would recommend getting this book, but she talks about like IPO filings, blog posts, press releases, conference papers, etc. So one thing that I really enjoy studying and sort of reading about is influencer marketing technology, because it's a huge growth area. So Influencer Marketing Hub is kind of an industry watchdog, and I would sort of question their methodology and the accuracy of this data, but we can say it's indicative. And supposedly there's 18,000 new companies offering influencer marketing related services globally in 2021, which is wild. And they do things like, well, I mean, these companies are like influencer marketing agencies, marketplaces that connect brands and influencers, influencer comments tools, things that will monitor the return on the investment from marketers, brand safety tools, which kind of do like algorithmic approximations of whether an influencer is going to have a scandal, and tools that offer additional layers of metrics and analytics. And you can find out information about these intermediaries. And this was just what I wanted to talk through, some places to go if you're interested in maybe studying like marketing industries or something like that. It's quite specific, but I'm sure it can be applied to other fields. But I'm an influencer gal. So one thing that you can do, which is good to do, is sign up to trade press and industry newsletters. So I really enjoy the Creator Economy newsletter, which is free, and it's a daily sort of newsletter from the information from Kaya Uranef. And it looks at funding trends in the creator economy and influencer cultures. So for example, they'll report on like, a lot of people are investing in live stream shopping, or a lot of people are investing in crypto influencer marketplaces and things like that. So you can get kind of an idea of where the industry might be going. So one example from the other day, which really gave me a severe headache, is this platform called Kale. So basically what Kale does, it's gone through a couple of rounds of funding and it's in beta, I think. But what it will do is find existing customers of brands that they're like kind of micro influencers. They've got between 1,000 and 10,000 followers. And supposedly what it does is like algorithmically trawl through people who've bought products and find out which ones are like worth partnering with. So in my interpretation, it's like working out who's hot basically, or who's got like a very nice aesthetic and a good profile. And then this tool will, or like the platform will reach out to the influencer, to the micro influencers and give them cash back for the product that they bought. So this to me is like, I'm working with UK Parliament right now, and this is a huge regulatory headache, because if you have paid marketing communications in your posts, then you're supposed to label that as advertising. So this tool is kind of, you're buying something, then you're going to get refunded for it later. So it's kind of like thought crime sort of ways of regulating advertising. So it's really, if this actually goes through, it raises a lot of issues also around algorithmic discrimination and pay, because, just being compensated for free products is not really sort of adequate labor compensation. So this raises a lot of issues, and like, we don't know if this is actually going to become a really big thing, but it just gives an indication of the way the industry is moving. But yeah, so this is just some points to remember if you're looking at trade press. It's like journalists mostly work from press releases, so they're just mostly sort of paying attention to what a company will say about itself. And these press releases are written by professional marketers. So you know, they're not necessarily completely accurate to what a platform actually can do. So to me, marketing trade press is really interesting to point, like, for the fact that it points to trends and funding cultures, and as a form of storytelling about how the industry sees itself, but it's not like always an accurate representation of what technology can do in practice. So we have to kind of add that caveat. We can't just like believe what the marketers say their stuff can do, because they're trying to get money. Another thing that you can do is sign up for free software trials, and there's definitely some ethical question marks around this. But if you are looking at tools and what they're doing in software, like that's proprietary, you can sign up for demos. Often it won't accept like a regular old Gmail email address. You need to kind of have a different one. So an academic one does work. But, you know, I've used this to get data, but that was through kind of making networks elsewhere. And I would say, don't just like show up on a software demo with a person who is going to walk you through how to use the product without telling them that this is going to be part of a research project. So you need to negotiate like the ethical side of that. But if you want to know the kinds of software that's being used in the industry, generally people are pretty happy to actually show you. Like they generally don't think, you know, that there's an issue with what they're doing, and they're proud of it. Also, I enjoy following industry like experts and algorithmic experts. So these are people that will tweet supposedly about how different algorithms are working. That's based on their own expertise and research. So they'll often have a lot of followers and will be influencers in themselves, but their content is all about kind of being a bit of an algorithmic watchdog, saying what the algorithm is doing on Instagram or TikTok or whatever it may be. And I wrote about them in this paper, about how they sell this like algorithmic lore about supposedly how the platforms work. So they conduct research on the platforms and how they work. They'll kind of frame them as truths, or often offer step-by-step guides on how to post successfully. But these people don't actually know how the algorithm works. Like, no one does, not even the people who work at social media platforms generally. But these are interesting again, because they're kind of like litmus tests of what's happening in the industry and discussions that are happening in the industry and how the industry frames itself. Oh, and I wanted to mention one last thing, which is, so I've been working with UK Parliament, which is a whole thing. That's been a wild experience, working with members of Parliament to help build regulation for influencers and influencer culture. And we have so much data that's been submitted to this inquiry. Like we had an open call for evidence, written evidence, oral evidence. We had Brooke Duffy, we had Crystal Aberdeen come in, we had the social media platforms, we had like all the major influencer marketing talent agencies, we had influencers, like all of them coming in and giving data to this project, basically to like, you know, help with the inquiry. And this is all publicly available. And I don't know if there's an equivalent of this in the US, but please, someone go and look at all of these transcripts and pieces of evidence if you're interested in influencer culture, because there's so much there. Thank you. Hopefully I didn't go too much over time. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Sophie. Not at all over time. It's fantastic. Thank you. Let's move now to our third speaker, Jeff Lane.
All right. Hello, everybody. So nice to be here with all of you. All right. So I'll talk a little bit about like what brought me to digital ethnography and some of the things I learned in doing digital ethnography along the way. So I really came to digital ethnography as an urban ethnographer and someone who wasn't particularly interested in digital life and wasn't particularly proficient in using technology. And so I'll sort of share with you that connection. And we have to go back in time to 2009 as well, when I was a doctoral student and when swine flu was the global pandemic of the day. And I just looked on my phone and Boom Boom Pow was the #1 song that year on Billboard. So anyway, so it feels like a long time ago. And my training and my interest was in doing long-term neighborhood field work in terms of urban ethnography. And And I started to do some field work in Harlem, where I was living, with a peace ministry, a youth ministry. And surprise, everyone was on their phone the whole time when I came to observe their lives on the street, in school, in this sort of drop-in space that was designated for the ministry. And I just took my cues really from the community, and came to realize pretty quickly that there was a really kind of rich digital history and digital life and digital side of this neighborhood that was playing out. And so I was spending time with teenagers, and not surprisingly, younger populations are maybe more heavily mediated than others maybe. And it was clear that they had all these memories of each other that was tied up with different technologies of the day. How their friendships kind of related to BlackBerry Messenger and the BBM lists and MySpace, and there was a local social media site called Sconex, and so they had been, growing up with each other and with these platforms, and they'd all been around each other in the neighborhood and through these different platforms. And so their memories of each other, their understanding of each other was so wrapped up with these digital sites. And sometimes we could even find these digital sites, ones that they had not deleted, but we could go find them, and they could show me what they were like when they were, 11 years old, 12 years old in some cases too. So there was this really rich history. And because I was in sociology, and I didn't feel that sociology at that time had really paid much attention to a lot of what was being done in communication and in media, I didn't know that there was this whole area called urban communication and this whole set of neighborhood studies that were showing us and explaining to us how media use organized community, and how community relations and organizational ties and interpersonal ties were all wrapped up with local media and ethnic media and increasingly digital media. So I, had this one kind of reckoning at this point where it was like, we have this urban tradition where we, really value the work we do and base it on spending, time in a neighborhood and relationships that are based in through real, local connections and through getting to know people over time. And there was really very little in there about how the phone or how social media were part of these relationships that we were there to study and part of the communities that we were sort of there to study, and not very much about what we were doing as ethnographers as well. And surely, like, the people that we were studying or that had been studied before were on their phone also, but you wouldn't really hear about that in a lot of the accounts and in a lot of the sort of field notes and all. So I, sort of made it my mission at this point in time to try to really link up digital ethnography and digital studies with urban studies, and to try to talk a lot about what communication and media and information folks had to say about urban life and cities and urban relationships. And then, really try to kind of like link up with this tradition of doing online research that I hadn't known very much about when I started out. And then I thought, I have something to say to the folks doing online studies as well, because a lot of that work that was identified as ethnography didn't actually spend time with folks offline or spend time with folks in person. And so that's like, so important to ethnography. So I tried to kind of blend these areas a lot. And I felt like the best data and the most forceful data came out of that connection between the digital and the urban and the online and the offline, and being able to sort of show how things that people had said or done on the internet had real repercussions in person, and that people's reputations and lives and finances and sexual lives and dating lives were actually being shaped by the things that they were saying and doing on social media, and how those that could access and see sort of slices of their lives online were using that material and interpreting that material as well. So I also felt that the work was the best and it was the most ethical when I had a relationship that had, started in person, started through living in this neighborhood, through being part of this ministry at first, and then taking on some other roles and having some other kind of connections in the community, asking people if I could follow them online, which was not any more unusual than the fact that I was doing an ethnography or that I was a white person in a mostly Black world. You know, it was just how you kind of kept going and how you kept communication going. And if you were going to be having some kind of relationship, whatever it was, you would have to be connected through a social media handle and through a phone. And so I felt like when those relationships were evolving in person and online, when I was in communication, in frequent communication with folks in person and online, when I was showing people the things that I was seeing online and asking about that material, when folks were expecting me to have kept up and would say, hey, did you see what I posted the other day? That to me felt like it was very clear what I was doing. Didn't mean I necessarily could interpret things right or understand Black teenagers or any of that, but I at least felt like we had kind of an ongoing exchange and a kind of mutual consideration and awareness and concern for each other. And in doing that, I felt like the data was the best quality and that the fieldwork was the most ethical or the most nearly ethical. And so that's just kind of one thing I want to underscore. And, you know, and then in terms of a challenge at that time that I really remember was just the boundlessness of my time, of the participation in the fieldwork, the networks that I was seeing, the sheer amount of data potentially coming in, and trying to sort of figure out how to manage that, you know, and thinking about like, okay, let me stay with these like core relationships. And if the online material and that content is being produced by those folks and pertaining to those folks, then let me work on that stuff. And then also kind of coming back to like the substantive frame of the study and kind of reevaluating that. Like, what is this about? What are my questions? What is a sort of set of questions that I'm trying to answer with this data and answer in this study? And in doing those two things, thinking about like the most grounded, most connected relationships, and then what my substantive frame was, I tried to, you know, kind of filter and limit what I was doing on those terms. Anyway, so on one hand, like I've really pushed for this kind of, you know, digital urban ethnography and this kind of comparative kind of online offline study where you're studying the same people on and offline, and you're in a position to kind of compare what people say and do in person and online. And I still feel very strongly about that as something really important to do, and as something that can make for rigorous, exciting, outstanding ethnography. Now, I've also been finding myself really pushed and being pushed to be a bit more agnostic about where ethnography has to happen. And, you know, learning more and more that this kind of like digital in-person distinction isn't always a productive comparison. And, you know, Christine Hine has talked about that for a long time. And Jenna Burrell's work kind of, I think, makes that point and all. And then like I was kind of, you know, if we can fast forward ahead to 2020, you know, and March 2020 in particular, when, you know, Melissa and I had been having, you know, conversations about fieldwork and realizing that a lot of our students were in this sort of same boat of the pandemic. And, you know, and whether, you know, I was being in a communication and media and information school, everyone was interested in digital life. Everyone was interested in digital media. Everyone was sensitive to that data. Everyone cared about that. But nonetheless, some people still wanted to do fieldwork in person. And all of a sudden we had this kind of moratorium on in-person fieldwork. And so it was an opportunity for us to try to like provide some support and try to, you know, work together to figure out how to do this. And then, you know, in being in communication, media, and information, I was all of a sudden exposed to tons of literatures and ideas that I didn't get to see as a sociology grad student. And that was also very, very exciting. And now I was an advisor responsible for doctoral students who, you know, were getting 4 years of funding and were on, you know, tighter timelines and didn't necessarily have 7 years to be a grad student. And so I was also thinking about how would I have to adapt my idea of ethnography and this kind of like badge of like long form in-person ethnography for the fact that people might not always want us in their physical spaces, right? For the fact that people are not going to always have years to be in a neighborhood. And so I'm being pushed a bit more now to kind of let go of some of the in-person bias that I think I have and yet I still have it and I still see its value and its weight. But I also wanted to just like spend 2 minutes here and tell you about some of the things that I think, really cut across and hold across ethnography, regardless of if we're calling it digital ethnography or if we're just talking about ethnography at this moment and whether we have the kind of ethnography we need for the present moment. So the importance of being there and getting in position to observe and to really immerse in what you're interested in, is key, right? And sometimes, that's not so clear what you're interested in, right? Sometimes it's more about some themes or some, sensitizing concepts or some people that have kind of taken your interest, but just, that willingness to be there and that commitment to being there. The inconvenience of fieldwork, like really holding on to that as something that's a good thing, right? The fact that we're working on other people's terms to meet them where they are and not to do things on our terms and in terms of our, comfort levels or in terms of what we're expecting or what we want. Obviously we have control over our lives and control over our studies, and we're in that sort of privileged position. But, there's an inconvenience of fieldwork that that could break down online when you can access people remotely. And so that's something that I think about a lot. Relationships as the basis of ethnography. And so, where and how do you have a relationship? And, I thought a lot about in my work in Harlem, like taking a drive with someone was something that was really special, where it was a chance to spend time one-on-one with someone in the field work and to get a sense of who someone was in private, in a one-on-one context. But I also felt like, personal chats, like just the sort of DM messaging that I had with some folks in my study, like that was also a very sort of personal space and a space to understand each other as well. And that was really important. And thinking about like, how do we have a relationship right now, and what do we do to maintain and really care for that relationship, regardless of where and how and when that relationship happens. And then like, the consistency piece of the field work too, like while you're dealing with all your internal struggles and your imposter syndrome, and I'm not saying like yours, like I'm saying mine, like all of us, the collective, you, like while we're going through that, our guilts, all that stuff that ethnography brings up and that trying to write about your relationships brings up, that can't stop the field work. You have to still keep going and doing it. And so that I think, holds. And then also being able to like sample across situations and settings, being able to see people in different contexts as they act and as they are one-on-one, in small group settings, in more public settings, in the kinds of settings that are only possible online, seeing what people are like with different parts of their network and in different contexts, I think. And that can happen, anywhere, or that's not a digital or physical kind of distinction. That's just something to kind of hold dear. And then the parts of the craft, like the parts of the craft of taking field notes, of framing interactions to show and tell what they mean, linking the micro to the macro, the analytic lenses that we bring to our studies, as Gerald Mack and Khan talk about, like that stuff is still the same, and so anyway, so that's where I thought I would kind of like leave off, just to kind of share with you a couple of reckonings that have happened for me that I consider incomplete reckonings, and to sort of offer a few things that I think hold across ethnography, whether we're doing digital ethnography or doing in-person ethnography, or just frankly doing ethnography.
Thanks, Jeff. Sorry I was a little bit distracted there by the unmuting that somebody had, but taking care of that. Thank you so much for your thoughts there. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Nick Seaver, our last panelist, and then we'll open the floor more broadly to everyone for your questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see so many friendly faces and names that I recognize and don't. Yeah, so I guess this picks up from what Jeff was saying. When I got invited to this, I thought, I'm not a digital ethnographer. And I think it's funny because I think people often assume that I'm a digital ethnographer because I study algorithmic systems, I study computery stuff in general. And I think in a lot of these settings, there's an assumption that work on these topics requires radically new methods, right? Because it's uncomfortable for people. I think it draws into question a lot of assumptions that we make in the social sciences about what humans do, about behavior, and so on. But then I thought, I was thinking about it, I'm like, well, really, most of the time I'm a really boring ethnographer. Like most of the stuff that's in my book is, I was visiting offices, I was interviewing people in their labs, I was doing ordinary sort of organizational ethnography kind of stuff. And I thought, okay, well, I'm sort of a poser then. This isn't really a thing that I'm relevant to. But as I thought about it, I was like, well, I guess that's not really true. Like I do, and I started listing in my head all of the stuff I do sort of online, just like as part of my research. I follow people on social media and they follow me and we have conversations there. I sit in on Zoom lab meetings. I do interviews through, it used to be Skype, but now it's Zoom all the time. I hang out on email listservs. I've been chat rooms with the people that they've got set up on Discord or wherever else. And that's all digital stuff. And it just seemed so unremarkable that I was like, well, do I really count as a digital ethnographer if I'm doing this? And I think part of why it seemed unremarkable to me, and I think it doesn't seem unremarkable to everyone who runs into this problem. And I think it's in part because I'm kind of an internet person, and most of the people that I study are internet people too. And I don't mean that to say like digital natives or any of that sort of nonsense, or to say that there's like one way of being an internet person, but that like I'm very comfortable in my ordinary life having a sort of fluidly online, offline kind of thing, kind of sort of like what Jeff's describing. And so the people I'm talking to often are as well, not always. And so when we meet online or, we talk on social media, it's sort of normal. So there's a bit I've talked about in, can't remember, an article or somewhere where I'm sitting in the office with people. I'm sitting next to someone who's in the office. I'm doing an ethnography of like this person who's sitting next to me. And we're talking through the computer because that's sort of normal in this open plan office situation, right? Where the fact of sitting next to someone is supposed to make it plausible to talk to them in an unmediated way. But it's much more comfortable for everyone if you're having your conversations on the computer. So I'm doing digital ethnography in person next to someone who I'm ostensibly studying. And it's really interesting then because you can see, what happens in the computer, what sort of emerges out into physical space. All of a sudden people pop up and move across the room. I got a lot of training, as Andre's putting in the chat, I got a lot of training in back channeling and the sort of like simultaneous multiple modality communication thing when I was a graduate student before I became an ethnographer at MIT in comparative media studies, where I was working with Henry Jenkins and a bunch of these sort of internet research and media studies folks, communication. Where that was like just it was a crash course in learning how to talk in two modalities more or less simultaneously. And it just seemed sort of normal to me. So it didn't seem like a problem. And then I was eventually at a workshop on ethnography at a business school. And we were having these conversations about like, how do you do digital ethnography? It's not the first digital ethnography rodeo for me. And people said, well, you can't, are Skype interviews like real though? Like you can't, this is before the pandemic. You can't really do like a full Skype interview. It doesn't make sense. It's always sort of awkward. And I asked the people who are doing this, do you normally use Skype ever? No, I don't really. Do the people that you interview use Skype ever? No, they don't. And okay, well, that seems maybe that's why it's awkward, right? It's not that it's awkward for interviews, but it's a social medium that you sort of have to learn how to use, like we know with any medium. And if you as a researcher are uncomfortable, if the people that you're studying don't use that as like a normal way of operating, then you're going to have a weird situation, right? And so you need to sort of match those things together. And this is sort of old school ethnographic observation in one way, because, this is true. Do I want to go here? Yeah, sure. This is true in the way that ethnographers like to say that interviews are bad, right? That we have this sort of like discourse in classic ethnography that like participant observation is real. Interviews are bad. Interviews are where people lie, and ethnography is where they tell the truth. Well, they don't, because they don't tell you anything. That's the same discourse that people using big data use to say that big data is real, right? And reported preferences are fake. So we can be a little skeptical. We know how to be skeptical of that idea in other contexts. We have a hard time with it in the interview versus participant observation thing. But I think that makes sense, that distinction makes sense if you are studying people who don't know what an interview is, not in terms of like on Skype, but like having even a social interaction that is an interview, that is interview shaped. That takes that person out of their space. However, if you study people who are in a cultural setting where they know what an interview is, they're very familiar with interviewing as a kind of genre of social interaction, it doesn't really take them out of their ordinary social life. If anything, they bring you into their ordinary social life in ways that are a little bit weird and that you may not expect, right? So they don't know how to get interviewed by an ethnographer, but they know how to talk to their therapist. They know how to talk to people who might want to hire them. They know how to talk to journalists. And those are all things that structure that interaction just as much as like the fact of being on the computer or the fact of, doing it over Skype or something like that. And so this is all a long-winded way of saying that I tend to think of digital ethnography and all the sort of digital aspects of this as just another set of sort of new structures for social interaction that we don't need to think of as radically different from the other ones that we already deal with, right? The fact that like someone having a conversation with someone, like a friend over lunch, is going to be doing a different thing than someone who is having a conversation with another person when that person's their boss or when that person's their therapist or something, right? Those are all settings that are going to organize what people say and do, just as much as doing it through the computer, like here. There are obviously some concrete things that are different. I can't talk to 224 other people at the same time quite in this way in in-person space. But I tend to go towards this, like everything is sort of the same. And the last thing I want to talk about, just to end earlier maybe, is why this might be. And I think that one of the reasons why I'm sort of like boring about my ethnography is because I'm coming from cultural anthropology. And coming from cultural anthropology, unlike in many of the fields that I've encountered people in based on my research interests, communication, media studies, STS, HCI, even sociology, we have to do ethnography. There's not another thing that I get to do. And so everything we do in cultural anthropology, we just call it ethnography, no matter what it is. So we do something that looks like what a historian would do, and we go into the archives and we call it, we're doing ethnography of the archives. No matter what we do, we call it ethnography. And I think this is actually sort of nice and not nice, maybe more nice than not nice, in that we don't worry about it. Like we don't worry so much about like whether something is like properly ethnography or not. We do sometimes, but I find that cultural anthropologists are generally willing to consider like any weird sort of interaction with the world as plausibly ethnographic. And so a lot of the concerns that I see play out in other fields adjacent to mine, where people are really anxious about making something ethnography or not, they haven't really seemed like big problems to me. However, where it's been less nice is that people often then don't formalize like, okay, what is different here? What would be useful to think about as being distinct? And so I want to just call out some people who have been doing this for a long time and working from contexts where the idea that any of these things could be ethnography was not taken for granted. And so reading them has really helped me sort of pinpoint the stuff that I'm working from on intuition. So there are people like Annette Markham or Anne Bolio or Christine Hines, already been mentioned, Nancy Bain. A lot of these people who are working particularly in sort of internet research, who did a lot of work to try to like prove to other people in the academy that this was like a legitimate way of doing research. And so I'm really grateful to that sort of prior generation of work let's get to a point where I can basically be like, yeah, I just do stuff on the computer, which is normal because people do normal stuff on the computer, and that's what ethnography is. So at the end of the day, my sort of take on ethnography is it's basically, we try to study ordinary life as our object and as our method. And so as long as we are participating in the sort of ordinariness of what we're trying to study, then we're good to go. And I think I'll cut it off there. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. I think what, Nick's big theme of his point is maybe something we can start with, because it seems like some of the questions in the chat are addressing it. And that is sort of, who is a digital ethnographer and who is not? Like I saw you said that, and then all the other panelists were like, oh yeah, me too. Like, I don't think of myself as a digital ethnographer. So maybe we can start there. Like, I wonder if you guys could maybe speak about that. I know, Nick, you just kind of gave us a nice little tour d'horizon on that. But also if I think about some of the questions people have, so for instance, in the chat, somebody saying, well, what how does field and field site change when you're doing online and offline work? And what costs are there for ignoring the hybridity? Someone else is asking about integrating offline and online ethnographical materials in a legitimate way. So I feel like this question of legitimacy, or, you know, are we really doing ethnography, is first and foremost. So I wonder if any of you wants to speak directly to that question.
Yeah, I could speak a little bit. Yeah, I just really like what you said, Nick, about that anxiety about, like, is it a real ethnography? Because that's something that I feel like I've experienced, but also, you know, I remember when I was doing my PhD, like, yeah, that was a topic of conversation. And I guess because people were anxious, they were also doing a lot of gatekeeping as well about all the rules for what ethnography is. And since, I guess, like for me, it's a question of confidence. And since I've become quite like more confident in methods that I use and what works for me and how I can sort of weave my narrative out of those methods, I've relaxed some of my kind of anxieties and rules about what like might be like strictly ethnographical. Like I didn't spend, like, I guess this is it's an interesting thing. It's like I did a 2-year ethnography of influencer ecologies where I was following a lot of influencers, and that was like a structured activity I was doing, and I was going to a lot of like influencer events, but you know, I wasn't like in a field site for 2 years, like every day, like going to the YouTube space or something. So like that was, I guess, something that would cause me a bit of vexation. But I think what you said, Nick, as well about being reflexive, like feminist methodologies, I think help really well with that, like really acknowledging like, you know, how you're constructing knowledge and what your data is and what the limitations are, like André was saying as well. Like I think being able to do that and just confidently like telling that story about, you know, how you've approached your, like the particular case or the particular sort of phenomenon you're looking at, like then you know, I think that's fine. Like Nick said, it's okay.
So I just want to pick up on that because I think that one of the defining features of, I don't know if this is true of ethnographers in general, so we're like really anxious about, you know, legitimacy stuff is coming up too. But what Sophie's describing, this question of like time in the field, I think has a lot to do with what people have been saying about like where you are when you're in the field. And I remember being in grad school and being really envious of my classmates who were going somewhere to be in the field. So they would travel to another country. And as long as they were in that country, they were in the field, and they could be in their apartment watching Netflix. They could be not thinking about it. They could be sleeping, and they would be in the field. I felt like I was never in the field. Like I was doing field work in the same period of time as a lot of these people, but I wasn't there all the time. And it really, that sort of this kind of stuff you see in a lot of interesting work about digital technology, say in the home, about how it really collapses, you know, various kinds of spaces together, becomes really legible and makes you realize how bogus the idea of a field site is as like a bounded space, because you're like, I don't know, am I there? Does it count? Like if I'm not literally in the office where I'm studying field, I'm outside the office, I'm not really in the field. But my friend who's in Morocco and watching Netflix in her apartment, that's the field, right? And so there's my anxiety as an ethnographer.
Yeah, Jeff or André, do you want to say anything on that topic?
My anxiety actually, Loic asked the question that has bedeviled me since I started doing this type of work with blogs. Like, am I an ethnographer, right? I know I do discourse analysis. I was trained in a linguistics and retcon program, right? And so I know how to look at text. The kicker for me was the bridge was Susan Herring's computer mediated discourse analysis, right? And so from there, because we're talking early 2000s, right? I was studying computer mediated communication, and those computer mediated communication areas just happen to be, like Nick said, on the computer. So I could observe them in real time, like Kevin Winstead's question just pointed out, or I could observe them later on because they were archived. And I got hailed as an ethnographer, even though I'm doing discourse analysis, because we, as various disciplines, have decided that those are communities on those online spaces, right? the trick is, and I think why actual ethnographers get a little salty when, like at AIR, I've sat on panels with Nancy and Annette and Joe Walker Retberg, right, asking this very same question, right? The ethnographers get mad because they're like, well, you're not living with the communities, you're not embedded in the communities, you haven't spent years with these communities. And I'm like, no, but I have the mechanics of community integration. I have a profile on the site. I regularly participate in the discussions, even if I'm a lurker. The site is recording my engagement. And so in some ways, we're satisfying those requirements for ethnography, but I still retreat, as Loic asked, I still retreat to saying I do discourse analysis first, right? Because in many ways, I don't necessarily, I'm not always clear on what being an ethnographer would add to my talents and my skills as a discourse analyst. And maybe you guys can help clarify that for me. Don't know if I added more confusion, but I'll stop there.
I mean, to pick up on that a little bit and Loic's sort of question there, you know, like I have a couple of reactions to it. And like on one hand, I think we're just sort of saying that like these methods are more fluid right now because of the sorts of digitization of life and because of the, you know, how much of our life is mediated and so an interview can be a little bit more ethnographic when you're, say, you know, bringing your interview participant into their actual digital traces and looking at their interactions and you know, and content analysis can maybe be more ethnographic when you're spending time with the authors of that content. And I think there's like a fluidity between like content analysis and interviewing and ethnography and qualitative methods right now that is tied up with the internet and with digital life. On the other hand, like I still feel like, you know, there are some differences a lot of times when we think about a content analysis and ethnography. I mean, you know, one difference is often whether the data was captured in real time, which you all have sort of talked about, and like was the researcher there in real time when this interaction was happening. That doesn't totally hold up, but that's one way I've seen, you know, one way to kind of to sort of slice it, right? So you're not, you know, going after retroactive traces, but you're part of a community or present for when these interactions are happening. That's overly simplified, doesn't totally hold, but something to it. And then I think just like the fact that we have this textual, written, or photographic data or video data, and that it's not fully formed, its meaning is not clear. And so we want to become personally familiar with the circumstances of people's lives in which that data was produced, in which that content and that communication was put out into the world. And because we have a relationship with that person, because we're curious and committed to understanding the context of that production, we're gonna, you know, try to tell some of that sort of story. That to me is sort of ethnographic. But, you know, again, everything I sort of say here, I keep having to sort of think through it really, really carefully right now because of the sort of fluidity of methods right now, and because of, I think, the just the breadth of data right now.
I think another big question that comes up related to this one, and that I see a lot in the chat here, has to do with the ethics of data collection. That can be formalized in the IRB dimension. I know some of you, Lydia, among others, were asking about that, and my students are constantly worrying about that aspect. But if I take up, you know, one of the earliest questions that came in the chat from Amy King, the question was originally for André, but I think everyone could address it. She asks how you balance the need for metadata with the ethics of collecting user data, like bios, profile photos, usernames, not handles, on platforms like Twitter with contentious users' perceptions of public, private, porous boundaries. So I don't know, André, you want to start us off on that one?
It's a fraught question, right? In part because a lot of I would argue that some of the, hopefully I'm using this word right, the epistemology of being an ethnographer is protecting your informants, the people you're working with, right? But because I'm often in the position of where I'm speaking Black communities and Black digital practitioners into being, in some cases, I want to highlight the creative ways they perform, they enact themselves, right, in these digital spaces, both as a way to identify themselves as being Black, right? Which my pseudonyms may not reveal in either as inventive a way as they did, or even being true to their original intent. But also because that signaling is part and parcel of the message they're attempting to address to whatever audience. So a long time ago, I studied the introduction of a Black web browser called Blackbird. And the first two places I went to look for reactions to Blackbird were Ars Technica and TechCrunch, right? You can imagine the shenanigans that the Black users had to encounter in those spaces, yet and still they didn't take the opportunity to change their names because that was an element of their pride and their digital presentation of self, right? Even as it subjected them to later abuse further down in the thread or in other comments, right? And so I understand the need to be protective, but I also am cognizant of the idea that for some folk, minoritized folk, that choice of name, whether it's a handle or a username, is deeply specific to how they understand themselves online. And taking that away from them in the interest of glossing or preserving the ethnographics ethical mandate is interesting. It's fraught, as I started off with. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, other panelists, what do you think about this business of the ethics in online spaces?
I suppose this connects to this question that you've all asked in the chat about being at risk, and the researcher and the subjects. I tend to think about these through a slightly different lens, which is that the people that I specialize in studying are like technical experts. So these are often computer scientists or programmers and so on. It doesn't mean they can't be at risk, but it means that IRBs certainly treat them differently. I do have to put up with a little bit of silliness from the IRB that's like, is this place public or semi-public? Like, what are you going to, and I have to say, how are they going to know what you're going to say? It's like, these are people who talk to others all the time and are very competent to manage their own interests. So I think part of what André is saying is that it's important to be tuned in to what the expectations are of the people you're talking to, because something you might do if you had applied it as a universal rule, like, oh, I'm going to give a pseudonym to everyone, I'm going to not quote people directly off the internet, is, that's not what some people want. And there's two ways you can go about that. You can say, well, I should give them what they want because they're themselves. And but I've also heard people suggest, oh, well, actually, that's a problem. If someone's expecting, that what your ethnography is going to be is like a platform for them to reach a broader audience with what they're saying, then it is sort of changing what they're, how they interact with you, right? If they understand you to be sort of like an amplifier, not necessarily a bad thing, but just part of the situation. IRBs are deeply not competent at the present moment, I think, to deal with any of this stuff, which is sort of fair because I don't think that it's obvious at all, like what's going on. But in my mind, the other question here is for me, and maybe this is related to some of the stuff that Sophie works with as well, is like, what do you do when the people you're talking to are sort of experts or are also working in their professional context there, right? You want to quote them. You don't necessarily want them to be identifiable for a variety of reasons. And I've had some interesting conversations with people recently, for instance, about the practices of fuzzing quotations from the internet, which I'm curious what other people think about this idea. If you quote someone saying something online, you should adjust it a little bit so that it can't just be Googled and gotten right back to them. Some people think it's a horrible idea. Some people think it's necessary. Some people think it's not going to work in the future. I'm curious what people think about that, because it's something that I do, but I'm not sure if it makes sense or if it's just a weird fig leaf for this sort of in-between period we're in right now, where it's not quite clear what to do with online materials.
Yeah, I would just pick up, not on the fuzzing thing, the thing before, which was when, it's when, I don't have a concern, I guess, about expectation of privacy in the power users that I study, because they're influencers that are, they're public, their behavior is very public, they're courting attention sort of explicitly. But I think this has been something that I've encountered when I've approached these people for interviews or, for any kind of research with them, is there is this expectation that it might benefit them in some way. And I do know, some people in the field might dangle that possibility as a way to get interview participants, which I think is wrong, especially when these people are working in areas that are often really exploitative and they're asked to do labor all the time for free. It's kind of really complicated to ask them to partake in that. And also, I can't promise that my journal article is going to get that many readers, really, practically, I don't think that it's going to help them that much. So I think but then, like, you know, Nick says, not necessarily a bad thing, but it's like just thinking about the answers and how they've been contextualized in that way. And the fact that these people like are professionals at giving interviews, and like, you know, I've commented in the past that if you look at some interview transcripts from influencers that have been published in some academic works, like I can compare those transcripts exactly to interviews that were given to Glamour magazine or to like a, you know, in a sort of PR context. And that again isn't bad. It's just like, you know, sort of understanding and recognizing that, and then thinking about the limitations of it, not that it's like a more authentic way of like, or like a pathway to someone's inner thoughts rather than like the media they make themselves. Because taking that media seriously is actually important too, right? They've actually had, you know, the tools all available to them, and they've made a lot of content that says what they want to say.
Well, there are a few things going on here too. I mean, there's the consenting participants and what you're going to do to protect their privacy and what they understand of your study, and how that's going to sort of play out. And then there's the third parties and the networks connected to these folks that are continually moving into your study as well, just by taking screenshots and by collecting digital data too. This, you know, network privacy problem, as folks have, you know, been talking about for a while. You know, this idea of like, when you're doing an in-person ethnography, you do get data on the network, right? It is sort of an egocentric network analysis to an extent, and you are learning about the people connected to the people that have agreed to be in the study. You run into them when you're walking about the neighborhood. They tell you about these people, and you might take down some of their personal details in your notes. So that's always kind of been there, but now it's happening much, you know, more. It's happening with more identifiable sort of details. So there's the you know, the consenting participant, and then there's the network, and those are both the issues that we have to be thinking about and talking about, and those both bring up stuff for the IRB. I often find that the IRB is concerned about that, the third party stuff, and the cleanest way to deal with it, I would say, I guess, is just to, you know, instantly scrub or delete any identifiable information on anyone that isn't a consenting participant. And then once you've cleaned that, or what, you know, that then working from that material in your field notes and keeping, you know, that material. The problem, you know, with that is that, you know, ethnography is not really linear, and we understand about people's lives and see connections that we do care about, and we might really want a lot of that material as well. And it might be really unnatural for the evolution of the ethnography to do that. But if we, you know, want to protect third parties in that way, that is one way to do it. And just to kind of take this in a couple other directions too, like you know, there's a push among some of our colleagues to name names in ethnography. And you could, one way to take this is to say, well, this is a good reason to name names, because we can't really protect people in the same way. And so, you know, that doesn't help with the most vulnerable populations and with criminal material, but that's another way to kind of come at it. And then there's also like getting back to the importance of a relationship, of just being like in a position to talk to people about the uncertainty of what's going to happen with their data and with this study, and to continually like try to adjust to their concerns and to kind of bring forward their understanding of their own privacy and their interpretations. And that's very different than what a lot of social media companies would do, for instance. And I think that's an important distinction when we're doing our research as well.
I want to think about this. You know, there's a question in the chat from Silas Udenze that I find intriguing. He asks how we deal with online fakeness while doing digital ethnography. And Silas, jump in if I don't get this right, but I interpret that to maybe mean people who are hiding their identities, or, you know, deliberately masking who they are to get messages across. I wonder if is that what you were trying to say?
Exactly.
Yeah. So, you know, one thing we could say to that is, well, that happens in the offline world too. Those of us who study elites, especially the way, you know, what Sophie was discussing earlier, you know, people who give the kind of PR version of what they're saying to a bunch of different places, you know, they're also hiding what they maybe really think in certain cases. So I don't even think it's necessarily an online only problem, but can we talk maybe more broadly about that, the particular aspect that we have in digital spaces where people might be really misrepresenting who and what they are? How do we account for that? How do we deal with it? Do any of you had direct experience with that you can talk about?
I guess I would like to ask the questioner to clarify what they meant by fakeness. Then I appreciate how you framed it, Melissa, but maybe they have a slightly different approach to it. And I asked that because I put in the chat when I first started doing this work in the early 2000s, because of Judith Donat's super influential essay, Identity and Deception Online, right? Most of the questions I would get at Q&As was, how do you even know these folk are Black? Right. And I used to use a Chris Rock joke. I don't know if I can use Chris Rock jokes anymore, but he was talking about he was the richest person in the room. And even the busboy with one leg, the white one, didn't want to be Black like him. And so I'm like, Black folk don't usually come online to pretend to not be. I mean, Black folk, when they show up online and say they're Black, they usually mean it. Right. And so it's an interesting question. Like, am I not, because Kevin Winstead and I were always talking about the Russian troll account. Is it Activist, Kevin? I think it is. Blacktivist, right? And a lot of Black folk responded to that account as if it was a real Black person, but it turns out it was something from the internet troll, internet research army, the Russian troll farm, right? And so it's an interesting question in both ways. Like, fake how? Are they fake in terms of they're building fences, or fake as if, how do we know they're even real people with the actual identities you put? But I guess like Chris Prasad is in here too, right? If just because, what if you're closeted? What if you can't out yourself? Does that mean you're being fake by playing straight in online spaces? Like, so what's the valence of fake we're talking about here?
Yes, Silas, do you want to jump in? Please go ahead.
I think being fake is also fluid. And from what you've just said, both of them could stand to be fakeness. So I think it would be right to get your perspective on both grounds.
I also wonder, André, if you could, the essay that you quoted at the beginning when you were just speaking now, I didn't catch it. I could put it in the chat the one you said you read, I think in graduate school on this topic.
Yeah, I'll drop a link in the chat, but it's Judith Donat, Identity and Deception Online. Nick, I see Nick nodding. I'm pretty sure you might have come across it, right? It was pretty influential in the 2000s when she published it.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say, sort of on setting aside the question of even like intentional deception, because I think that's a problem, like you were saying, Melissa, that sort of like all ethnographers in any context might have to deal with. And we have our own history of like scandals around ethnographers being tricked. And so it's not, it sounds like you get tricked in slightly different ways online for sure, but we get tricked all the time, probably. The thing that I would bring up that I think is interesting is this question sort of more basically about like, how do you know that you're studying the people that you think that you're studying, right? Like, how do you decide who the ethnos of your ethnography is? And once you're doing that, like, how do you know who should really count? And the one thing that came up a lot while I was doing research was that a lot of people are getting hyped about sort of digital methods around Twitter data collection, sort of like André was describing before. And they were doing things like scraping hashtags to learn about the discourse within a particular community. And one thing that I found really interesting, because I was with all these people doing music recommender systems, was that it was true that some people would tweet with a hashtag that indicated they were talking about music recommender systems, say on Twitter. But the people who did that were a sort of peripheral set of people who had to put that tag in so that they could be seen, right? Who were like, I'm part of this community. But if you were like actually in the core, like if people understood that that was what you were and you didn't feel like there was any doubt, you just tweeted. You didn't have to use that. And so the result is that if you're sampling specifically for people using a hashtag that represents a certain kind of professional community in particular, you're sampling for strivers, you're sampling for people who are not necessarily the core. It may vary across fields, but I knew this just because I knew some of these people, and I was always, and you look at the hashtags, like, who is that? Like, that's, nobody knows who that person is, and that's not faking necessarily, but it does point to some of the ways that the ease of collecting data online makes it, it sort of foregrounds this question of like, how do I even know who I'm studying? Like, how do I know who the ethnos in my ethnography is?
Right, like that's such a good point. And one thing that in this parliamentary inquiry that we're doing, which has been called influencer culture, which I didn't name, and I think it's like not a great name because basically we've not reached a consensus after over a year on what an influencer is. And you can think about sort of like ways of categorizing that with like metrics. They have to have a certain number of followers, they need to earn a certain amount of money, they need to like work with a certain number of brands or something. But it's really difficult to pinpoint like, when does someone stop becoming like an aspirational influencer and when do they become a professional influencer? And you know, obviously, like actually all of those people are really interesting to study, I guess, for various different reasons, but it's really challenging. And yeah, I was just also thinking like about some of the challenges. Like I was talking to these guys at the markup recently. They're trying to do this study because basically there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence that Black YouTubers are more likely, like their content is more likely to be age gated, like slapped with a 18 plus or 16 plus or whatever YouTube puts on there. And one thing they were really trying to do is like take samples of different groups and like compare the videos that are age gated, but obviously it's really, really difficult to approximate someone's race online or like categorize it. And there's tools that do it, but they do it really badly. And there's lots of sort of ways for like bias and things and errors to leak into that. So yeah, I guess it's like thinking about that from the other side. And you know, that kind of work tends to be like the sort of, we're going to prove how algorithms work sort of work, which, you know, is a bit difficult to do even if it's well-meaning. But yeah, they asked me for ideas and I didn't have any, but people can get in touch with them, because yeah, it's hard.
I mean, I'm not sure you're doing ethnography with someone if you don't know them in the most basic sense. I mean, you know, like I just feel like that's kind of so much of our data is your sense of people, is your sense of the people with all its problems and all its limitations. But you know, so if you're that to me is can you do it?
I feel like you're trying to fight. How about? I feel like you're trying to fight, Jeff. Is this fighting words? Because what do you mean know somebody? If it's somebody I've been Twitter friends with or online friends with for 20 years, but I've never visited their house. Never
Oh,
seen
that
them in
counts. No,
person,
those
do
are
I
your
know
friends.
them?
Those are your people. No, I'm not. Those aren't fighting words, because what I'm saying is, I'm just saying, like, if we don't know someone's basic, you know, some basic demographic information about someone, if we don't know that they even exist as a human being, like that's not, I mean, what do you can't do that much with that, right? Like that's where I'm coming from. That, you know, that like your relationship, whether it's in person or online, but your relationship over those years, that's your data and that's your understanding of the social world, right?
Well, at the risk of being difficult, I will say I don't presume to know a person or a community, in part because I'm aware, because of the heterogeneity of Blackness, that my perspective on Blackness necessarily will often differ from the groups of people for whom I study, right? And so I could gloss and say, well, I know them, they're Black, I'm Black, we have something in common, but I prefer to act as if I don't. And let my conceptual framework do the work of providing a lens into how those people are operating. I love it. Those people are operating, in part so that my audience can pick up on my conceptual framework to understand what I'm looking at, as opposed to relying on my perception of my relationship with those people. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I'm letting the philosophies that those people express about themselves be the lens for knowing, right, who those people are for my readers.
I feel like that makes sense to me. I feel like a lot of our data and our analysis, though, is around this challenge of like, to what extent and how do we know people, and what's our evidence for the claims that people bring to bear on who they are and who we think they are. And that kind of conversation and that challenge and that difficulty is very much, to me, what ethnography centers on.
I want to open this up to people who want themselves to ask questions. I did notice one other thing in the chat, and I know a lot of people really want to know about this, which is the workflow question. So really the nuts and bolts, the mechanics, like how do you collect the data? How do you organize it for analysis? Yunha Cho asks, how do you capture data on screen? Is it screenshots? Lydia asks, like, if you're doing screenshots by hand, yeah. So if you guys want to speak to that, and then of course others, maybe just put your hand up in the little icon thing, and we'll just jump in when the time's right, or I can call on you if you want.
I love screenshots. Like I think I did more kind of journaling and like taking notes throughout my PhD, but the screenshots have been the most useful data to me, like in that project and projects since then, especially like I looked at one algorithmic influencer tool. That tool has now been shut down. It's been bought by someone else. Yeah, so that, and like having those screenshots is really, really like invaluable now. And I think, yeah, I didn't like, you know, I knew intellectually that platforms change and that like a lot of the data that I used to be able to access wouldn't be there, but I didn't like feel it until it really went missing. So yeah, I think like big like hand capturing screen grabs fan now.
I'll jump, even though I'm talking too much. Every internet researcher conference, we get this question: how do you collect data? Right? Every time, right? And it changes as the technologies change, as the equipment changes, but also as the APIs and platforms change too, right? So screenshots used to be the only way you could capture a lot of internet data in its original form. Because when you tried to capture it as a download through wget or curl or whatever, you then would have to do a hell of a lot of cleaning so that the analysis programs would be able to accept it. And so to me, it stripped a lot of the nuance of the stuff that I want to collect by rendering it down to utterances so that in vivo or hyper research or whatever was able, or I can't remember the names of all the qualitative discourse analytic programs, right? So that you can analyze it, right? Evernote is something that people have mentioned that they use to collect data. I actually jumped on, because I'm easily distracted. I actually jumped on to say that screenshots are even more key now because Twitter's starting to implement a new policy where if somebody deletes a tweet that has been embedded elsewhere, that tweet's embed is now also deleted. Right. So many of us, me, rely on third-party placements of tweets in order to at least start to find the phenomenon we want to study. So like in distributed blackness, I actually include a couple of websites that embedded tweets by Aisha Curry and people who responded to her. Right now, because of those embeds and Twitter's new policy, what you get when you go to those pages, if they're still up, are blank spots. Twitter used to reproduce just the text sometimes, but now it's a blank spot and saying, if you want to see more tweets like this, go to Twitter. Then you click on the thing and it takes you to your Twitter feed, which has nothing that you asked for, right? So screenshots are key because of the ephemerality and the link rot, which we don't talk about as much anymore. That happens with the digital stuff that we do. It's a great start. The other thing I would add for those who are interested in collecting data, something I've been talking about the last few days, if you are doing TikTok or YouTube or any other visual form, what can you download for TikTok, right? You say, oh, I can download the video. Okay, but is the video the entirety of the TikTok experience that you want to talk about? Right? Are you not also talking about the mechanics that are embedded on the screen on top of the TikTok video, like the type of music that's playing and whether that changes, the interactions that people are having on screen? How do you capture that shit, right? And so again, the technology changes. I don't think TikTok has an API at this moment where you can capture that additional information. And so we're constantly scrambling to keep up with these things. So it's a great question, but it will change every time and every person you ask, these answers will change.
Chris, do you want to jump in?
Sure. So I just wanted to speak to the collecting methods questions. I'm in the middle of my PhD, so I'm constantly thinking about how do I save all the things that I'm collecting. I study both live streaming and sexual content, so you can imagine there are different methodological questions that go into how I record things. But I'll say that I organize all of my screenshots into essentially like nested folders that are labeled per either person or event, quote unquote, that I'm interested in. And then I also have plain text metadata that I generate myself mostly about those interactions so that later on I can go back and sort of reconstruct that particular thing sort of post hoc, in addition to notes that I take while I'm watching, say, a live stream. I think also I try to stay away from proprietary sort of file formats because you never know what software might not exist that you use to like open and sort of analyze all of your data. So I try to stick to sort of plain text and like other sorts of image formats that are easily openable by other programs, but that's just a me thing.
Does anyone else want to jump in with a direct question or something that you asked?
Sorry, just to answer,
get to, or, yeah.
To follow up on what Chris said, and not to beat the same drum, ethnographers are bad with their files always, like historically. Like we don't know how to store any of the stuff that we collect anywhere. And so this is self-promotion, but at the AAAs this fall, hopefully, I'm co-organizing a roundtable with Anna Weichselbraun called The Anthropologist as File Manager, which is about how anthropologists working online or offline just like organize their stuff at all, because it's totally absent from like any method. Not that I get any methods training as an anthropologist, it's kind of one of the things we like to do, but it's, you know, it's not there, whether or not it's online or otherwise. And so hopefully we're going to be putting together some more stuff about exactly this question historically, as well as in the sort of present digitally specific moment.
Fatima, yes, you had a question in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to it. So,
oh, it's fine. Thanks. I actually have a question for the panelists more about, you know, presentation of self online, right? This is a question that all of us think about just professionally and personally in life, of course, but when you're thinking about ethnography and studying digitally or digitally together with non-digital domains, right? How do you think about your construction of self and your presentation and your interaction with folks, especially in the sense of, you know, a lot of times we're interacting with people with very conflicting points of view, organizations with drastically different political positions, and groups that, you know, have very antagonistic relationships with each other, right? That's part of what we study as social scientists, right? And so I'm not talking about presenting fake versions of self or whatever, but, you know, like in everyday life and in our field work, we're constantly presenting one part of our fragmented self and then another part of what makes us who we are in the social position we occupy in the world. So we all know what that's like, you know, in the non-digital world, and we do this online, but I'd be curious to hear how you navigate that in your fieldwork when you are expected to really be present, right? It's not like you just have your Instagram profile and you're there every once in a while, but you actually have to interact with folks, and that may or may not come into conflict with how you need to project yourself or interact with folks in another domain of your research to develop rapport, make sure the door's not closed to actually get into that office, even as you're interacting with another group with different points of view. So, I mean, this is stuff we do in real life and in field work, even in the non-digital world, but all of a sudden this stuff is increasingly more visible and more permanent, right? So I'd love to hear how you're navigating that in terms of construction of profiles and interactions, and even, you know, how you're, you know, maintaining profiles or not, you know, anyway.
That's a really, really good question. Like the way I struggled that the most was offline, when I was going to like in meet space, when I was going to influencer conventions, and like at one point I was removed from the convention and they were like, your lipstick has not been put on properly, and then they were like, you need to go to the, I mean, it was kind of like a little bit all over my face, but they were like, can you like go and sort it out and like then come back. So I feel like, I mean, again, like I guess like everyone's saying these issues, like, you know, self-presentation issues where we're in spaces as ethnographers and wanting to, like you say, you know, be able to build rapport with the people that we're having conversations with, but also I guess as we always strive to be a bit like authentic in ourselves, it's really challenging, and it's really hard. I mean, I'd also be really interested to hear Ashley's perspective on this, because obviously, like, you know, this is like something that she's looked at a lot too. Yeah, so that's just one kind of thought I had. Sorry, it's like 7:30 here, so I think my brain is running.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, it's 8:30 here for me. So, and it is actually time to wrap up. So maybe I don't know how to close such an event other than to say yes. The presentation of self is, I think, obviously something that ethnographers are attuned to, and then people that are using social media are very much attuned to as well. And I've been studying type of influencer as well, and doing it in person and also online. And I feel like I'm just really behind on internet culture and social media presentation of self. So my strategy is just to lay low and kind of follow their cues of like what to say and how to respond. And I kind of just do a lot of mimicry. There's data in that. And then, yeah, in person, I just make sure that the lipstick is on, right? going in. So, okay, let me take a moment to just thank everybody because we're at time. This has been a tremendous event. The chat is just really incredible. I say that we keep it open for just a little bit longer, you know, after if people want to, you know, copy links, but it will be available as a recording. Yes, Melissa, it'll be sent out as an email and also posted on the Rutgers site, and maybe we'll post it on the Ethnographic Cafe too for historical record. And also because of the great usefulness of all of your remarks. So I thank the panelists for your insights, and yeah, thank you to all of the participants for your great questions and contributions. And the next panel, so for the Ethnographic Cafe, we are meeting next time on April 29th for Claudio Bentacri's book, which is called The Perfect Fit, a global ethnography of shoes and fashion. And then we have another special event on May 20th. So thank you all so much for coming. And check out our website, the Ethnographic Cafe, because there are links there to readings that our panelists have recommended, and then lots of other cool stuff. So yeah, thank you all. Okay, yes, I'll do emoji.